Oh, gosh. Well, hey, you guys, welcome to the Connection Point Worldview podcast. And as always, we're here with Pastor Trey Shigley and Dr. Zach Breitenbach. My name is Ron, and we're a part of the ministry of Connection Point in the Indianapolis area of Indiana. And this is a podcast designed to help take you as a parent or guardian a little bit deeper into places that your student has already gone. So welcome back, you guys. Thanks for diving in with us this time. So you started a special Worldview series with the seniors, the 12th graders recently. Tell us what you discussed in that first week and what you plan to do in the rest of this series, Zach.
Yeah, so this is a very important series, and we'd love for you to talk to your student about it because we talk a lot about worldview, and Trey and I are called, the Worldview team or Worldview ministry at Connection Point. But what is a worldview? And so that's kind of what this whole discussion was about. What's a worldview and what's a Christian worldview? So we talked about a definition of a worldview, whether everyone has a worldview, how a worldview shapes the way you look at things, what does it mean to have a Christian worldview, and what impact does that have on your life. But this isn't just an academic exercise of sort of giving a definition. It can seem kind of dry and boring if, they're just going to define a term for them. But that's not really what this is about. We do define the term worldview, but we really unpack it. And we talk about how this concept is very practical and relevant in our lives. And we even started off with some examples. And we talked about, say, 9/11. And you look at that and you say, man, did these people these terrorists, did they just wake up one day and say, I think I'm going to fly a plane into a building? Obviously not. There was a worldview behind it. There was a belief system that led to your actions, and we talked about how our beliefs affect our actions. We talked about Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 when a white supremacist ran over protesters in a car. What would cause someone to do that? How can two people look at something and see it so differently? I would look at that and say that is evil, but to the person who did that made sense to them. They thought that was something that made sense to do. Or even something more positive like becoming a medical missionary. Why would somebody commit their life to doing something like that? This topic is not just about giving a definition. It's about understanding who we are at our core and why we do the things we do. And as far as the rest of the series, the next 2 weeks that we have with the seniors, we let them pick what we're going to do. We gave them some options. And so next week we're going to be doing a Q&A. So who knows where that will go, but excited to see what questions they come with. And then the third week, we're going to be talking about sort of the big story of the Bible. How does the whole Old Testament and New Testament fit together? What's like the overarching story? And then a little bit about church history. What happened after the Bible? So we'll talk about Acts, the book of Acts, and early church history, and then kind of a high-level view of what happened in church history after that. So that's what they picked, and I'm excited for us to talk about that.
That's cool. Plenty to tune in for in these upcoming weeks. So you gave a long definition and then a short definition of worldview. Can you sum those up for us, Trey?
Yes. So I'll give us the short definition and then the long definition, and don't let the long definition scare you because then we'll break it down kind of into parts to explain it more. But very simply, a worldview is our view of the world. It's how we answer the big questions of life, and it guides how we live. So it's just how do you view the world, answer its big questions, and then how does that guide how you live? It's also could be described as a story. We use stories as human beings to explain everything. And your worldview can also be a story that we believe explains how life works. How did everything begin? Where did we come from? What's wrong with the world? What's the purpose of my life? How do we fix what's wrong with the world and with us? And how do we end up? Where's everything going? And that's the framework of a story. And so your worldview can also be often described through the lens of a story. And then if we break worldview down into maybe a longer definition, it would be that it's our beliefs, which may not be true and may not be consistent, It's the beliefs that we accept, perhaps even without thinking much about them, about the way the world or reality really is. So it's about the big questions of life. Our worldview also includes our commitments and our heart desires, and it's foundational to how we live and how we behave. So that's kind of the longer definition. But what we took students through is breaking down kind of each of those parts. And so a big part of a worldview is that it includes beliefs that we accept, but maybe we don't give them a lot of thought. We haven't actually processed. Not everyone has thought through why do they believe what they believe. And so if you question them like, okay, why do you believe that? Or why do you say that? They might be like, oh, well, I don't know. Like it's something they believe, but they haven't actually given it much thought. And then it's about the big questions of life. It's not about what your favorite snack is, your favorite toothpaste flavor, your favorite cereal, but it's about the big foundational questions of life. Things like, what is ultimate reality? Is there a God? What is God like? Is there no God? What is the universe? Is it eternal? Is it created? Does it have a purpose? What's a human being? Are we accidents of nature? Are we kind of made in God's image? Is there an afterlife? What is the afterlife like? So these big questions of life. Some other ones are like, how can we know what truth is? Can we really know what truth is? What is morality? Is morality even a thing that is true apart from us, or is it just kind of depending on person to person? And is history going somewhere? Is there purpose to everything? Is life cyclical, or is it going someplace? And so those are some of like the big questions that a worldview is answering. And the thing about your worldview, because everyone has one, is that it may be true or it may be false. And we know just from logic, not everyone's worldview can be true because there are worldviews that contradict each other. And so your worldview belief may be false. And there are some worldview beliefs that are also true. And then the thing about your worldview, because we haven't thought through them always, is that they aren't always consistent. We often contradict ourselves, and we can see that in the way we act. Sometimes we act differently than what we say we believe, or sometimes we have two beliefs and we haven't really reconciled them with each other. And so often morality is something that we get into contradictions where we say, some people might say morality is individual, depends on the person, like each person decides what's right or wrong. But then we condemn certain things like racism, right? Or slavery or other things, murder. And it's like, okay, well, that applies to all people. You're not saying that a morality is relative here. So we're contradicting ourselves if we go that path. And then our worldview isn't just about what we believe mentally or what we think logically, but it also involves our heart desires. Sometimes, not sometimes, most of the time, we don't do what we say we believe. We do what we feel is true. And so we do what we want to do. And so your worldview is often revealed through your attitudes, through your heart posture, through your actions. And it really is more than just a mental conception of the world, but it actually is shown through how we act and believe. And finally, a worldview is the foundation for the rest of our life. How I live, how I behave, it all rests upon that. Kind of like the classic example of an iceberg, right? Most of the iceberg is underwater, and that's your worldview. What you see is what's above water. It's your actions, your speech, how you treat people, how you go through life, but all of that is resting on your worldview, how you answer the big questions of life. So that's kind of how we broke it down for students.
So it seems to me that some people tend to avoid thinking about the big questions and just kind of skate through life. So does someone like this have no worldview? Is it possible to have no worldview? Can you speak to that one, Zach?
Yeah, we talked about that question, and this from the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. If you've ever seen that, Ferris Bueller at one point in the movie says isms, like theism or pantheism or deism, the different belief systems or worldviews of the world. He says isms are not good. A person should not believe in an ism. He should believe in himself. So in other words, he's basically saying, I don't have a belief system. I don't have a worldview, and a person shouldn't have one. I just believe in myself. Well, the problem with that is that is actually expressing a worldview, right? It's expressing something that might be described as like egoism, where you're kind of the center of your world.
You're wrecking one of my favorite films, by the way. Here,
it was a fun movie. But I don't think it's possible, right? Because even someone who does skate through life and doesn't think very deeply, as some people don't think very deeply, they tend to absorb their worldview, right? We all go through life, and every day, by the way you treat people, by the way you speak, the way you act, it's flowing from the way you understand reality to be, right? Even a baby has a very rudimentary sort of worldview. They understand when I cry, my mom comes and gives me food or whatever. And that's how reality works, right? At a very basic level. As we get older, it gets more sophisticated, but we all have an understanding of what we take the world to be, what we think reality is like, and we live accordingly. So I don't think we can escape that. We can't get away from it. It's not possible to just opt out of having a worldview. It is possible to not think very much about your worldview, which is not recommended,
right.
But it's not possible to just have no worldview.
So one more question on something you said earlier. You said a worldview can be thought of as a story that makes sense of the world. So can you give an example of that? Yeah.
So every story, as Trey mentioned earlier, has sort of like a beginning, sort of some explanation of why the world's screwed up, why there's problems in the world. Can we fix it? If so, how? And then there's a conclusion to the story. So an atheist story, for example, might go, and atheists might have different worldviews and different ways of thinking about how reality is, but it could go like this, like, where did we come from? Well, we're accidents of nature. Why is the universe here? Just no purpose. It's uncreated. We're uncreated. We've evolved without God, that sort of thing. Well, what's the big problem with life? Well, the problem is religion. Religion is unscientific. It blocks progress. Well, how do we fix this problem? Well, science and technology and eliminating religion, making the world secular and focusing around technology and science to make life a better place. And what's the goal? Where are we trying to end up? Well, a non-religious society that has eliminated religion, the cancer of the world, and we'll all live better by technology. We'll live healthier, happier lives. And so that's a story, right? That's a way of seeing where did we come from, what's the problem, what's the fix, where does it end up? Not all atheists would agree with that story. That's a fairly optimistic atheistic worldview, but there are less optimistic ones. And Christians have a story too, right? We have a story of where did we come from, right? We're created by God. We're made in His image. The universe was not an accident. It was specially created by God from nothing. What's the problem? Sin, the fall, right? We've rebelled against God, and that had real consequences, including spiritual death and us being separated from God. Well, what's the solution? Is there one? Yes, Jesus came and He died for our sins, and there's a chance to be freed from that and made right with God and live with Him forever. And, well, how does it end up? Well, there's going to be a judgment. Jesus is going to return. Those who've accepted Jesus and His salvation won't have to pay for their sins, and everyone else will have to pay for their own sins. So this is a story. You can frame your worldview, the way you look at the world in reality, in terms of a story in that way.
So then you moved into talking about a Christian worldview. You began with I think, kind of a concerning statistic. Trey, you want to talk about that for us?
Yeah. Barna, which is a research group, they in one of their in some of the research, they found that about 2/3 of teens who were kind of raised in the church end up walking away from the church sometime in their 20s. And so, if you're concerned at all for the future of our youth and for the next generation, that should be a very concerning stat. Like 2/3 of kids raised in the church are walking away from the church in their 20s. And that's incredibly concerning. And some of the research, they did they seem to indicate that one of the main reasons a person walks away from the faith is because they don't have a biblical worldview at the core of their identity. And one of the studies they did is that they saw, like, okay, what are students actually learning? And they're learning Bible stories, Bible people, they're having fun. And honestly, that's about 90 to 95% of kids in the church are learning the stories. They can name you most of the main Bible characters. 90% say that they have fun and they have a really positive view of church. But only 9%, according to Barna, have a biblical worldview. And this is huge because, as Zach mentioned, your worldview, you may think you don't have one, but everyone does. And if you aren't intentionally being discipled into a biblical Christian worldview, culture will disciple you into their worldview. And so it doesn't happen by accident. It happens intentionally. But oftentimes we aren't focusing on those key worldview pieces, and they are subconsciously absorbing the worldview of whatever is around them.
I'm adding a little bit in here, but is there a distinction between walking away from the church and walking away from the faith? I mean, there's obviously a correlation because your faith can be developed in church, but then I could also kind of imagine that some students find the church part irrelevant and walk away from a weekly gathering, a worship service, a class, or Sunday school or whatever, but not necessarily from Jesus. I know that's a little bit off track, but it makes me think of that. Have you
that's
seen
true.
or found some of
There
that?
is a difference between walking away from church and walking away from Christ, and it is possible to have a relationship with Christ and not go to church,
Right.
though that's not advisable,
Right.
and not biblical.
No.
But that statistic that Trey mentioned is about church teens who stop going to church. So it's teens who went to church at least 2 weeks out of a month as teenagers, and then between the age of 18 to 29, they just stop going.
Yeah.
And usually when you do walk away from church, you're not in a good place spiritually, and you're not seeking God, and you're just checked out.
Yeah.
And as Trey said, Barna found that it's mostly because their Christian faith wasn't really at their core. It wasn't something foundational to who they are, and it was easy for them to walk away from church,
Right.
and likely from God.
Yeah, if it's not really contributing to their discipleship journey, but it's just kind of a fun hangout, and that's all it is, I could see why it would be easier to walk away from.
Yeah.
So that's big stakes. So what'd you say about how the Bible answers the big questions of life? Zach, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so Trey kind of mentioned like some of the big questions that your worldview is going to answer, even if you haven't thought about it very much. But let's run through it real quick, right? So what is ultimate reality? Well, it's not the universe, it's God. God is the ultimate foundational thing to reality. He created the universe. The universe isn't the thing that's eternal and uncreated and always there. Ultimate reality is God. It's the Christian God, the Trinity, who is perfect in every way and has all these omni qualities. What's the universe? Well, God made it. He made it from nothing. It hasn't always existed, but God has. What's a human being? Well, we're made in God's image. We're loved by God. We're special to God. We're more special than the physical universe by far, but we're also rebels against God. We're sinners and rebels, but we're loved by God. Is there an afterlife? Yes. So we will be with God forever or punished forever in hell, separated from God. Can we know how the world is? Yes, God has created our minds to be able to know and understand at least adequately the world that He's created. We don't have perfect understanding, but we are able to understand the world, which in philosophy is a big question called epistemology, and it's a big question of can we know things and what can we know? Well, as a Christian, I think we have a basis for thinking we do know things at least adequately because God designed our minds. What's morality? Is it real? Yes, it's real. God is the perfect moral standard. Evil is rejecting God's commands. We have a moral law that applies to us whether we like it or not. That's a huge part of our worldview. We don't get to make it up for ourselves. Is history going somewhere? Yes, according to the Bible, history is leading to the return of Jesus. History is not random. It's under God's sovereign control, and it's not cyclical like reincarnation. It's going in a line. It's heading toward something. It's headed toward Jesus' return. So if you think that that's the answer to these questions, that's going to shape everything else. It's really going to shape how you live and how you see the world.
We're kind of building it here, but then what would be a good definition of Christian worldview? How's that related to the greatest commandment? Zach, you maybe spoke to that.
So, like we've been kind of indicating, a worldview is not just your head knowledge and your beliefs, but it's kind of the whole of yourself. It's your will and desires. It's your emotions. It's your actions and speech. It's your thinking that underlies everything. And I think this relates to the greatest command of Jesus, because when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest command? He said, love the Lord with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And the second greatest is to love your neighbor as yourself. So I think a worldview involves, a Christian worldview involves this, right? If I was to sum it up, your faith in God defines every part of who you are, and your whole self is aimed at loving God. So you love God with your heart. You love him with your mind and your thinking about the big questions of life. We want to line that up with the Bible. We love God with our soul and our desires and our inner self. We love God with our strength, our physical body, our actions, our speech. So our mind, our will, our actions, our body, our attitude, everything is oriented toward loving God and loving others and honoring God in every area of our life. And we want to have consistency in that, so that our mind doesn't say, I believe this, but then the rest of our life and our actions and our speech and our emotions and attitudes, they don't line up. A genuine Christian worldview is going to have consistency in all those areas.
I like that link to the Great Commandment there. Okay, so you closed out with some personal application and the story of a young man who showed what it means to have a Christian worldview. Wrap us up talking about that, Trey.
Yeah. The whole point of us talking about worldview is we want it to become actually practical, and for at least people to see that it is practical and then live that out. And so one of the things we had our high school seniors do is, hey, what are some areas of your life that are most hard to bring into alignment with a biblical worldview? What do you see your peers struggling with to bring into alignment, and what do you personally? Is it in the area of what you watch or what you listen to or what you say or how you work or how you play sports or, how you relate to your friends or to your parents or the things you do on the internet or the words that you speak, how do you spend your money? So everything you do in life can be filtered through the filter of a biblical worldview. And one of the keys I think is huge is if your life does not contrast with or look weird at all to the people around you, then you most likely are not living a biblical worldview. Because the biblical worldview is so drastically different than the cultural worldview and the worldview of other people around you, your life should look different. And if your life isn't presenting things that are kind of shocking or unique or that stand out, then maybe you aren't fully living out your Christian worldview. And so we gave some examples of, okay, you're tempted to cheat on a test. Okay, you say everyone is cheating, but if you're looking at it through a biblical worldview and you're wanting to live in integrity with that, how would you respond? How would you act in that situation when you are tempted to cheat? Or say you have a grandparent who was a believer who passed away. How does you grieving through that process, how does that grieving process look different for you than for someone who doesn't have a biblical worldview? And we gave a great example of this man named William Borden. And he lived a long time ago, about 150 years ago, and his life is one of that was shocking to the world around him. He was born in a really rich family. He had a really huge inheritance that was coming to him, and he traveled the world when he was a teenager just because he could, and his parents paid for him to go around the world. But what he saw around the world broke his heart. He saw people who were living in poverty who didn't know Jesus. And so he decided after college, to become a missionary. And so he gave up his fortune, he gave up his privilege, he went into some of the toughest places in the world, and the people around him were shocked. His parents were shocked. They're like, what are you doing? You could live the life of ease, of power, of privilege, of prestige. And yet he's saying, no, my worldview, my biblical beliefs are driving me towards this. And so he had this call from the Spirit, and he chose to obey it. And it's a really powerful story. He actually ended up getting sick and dying at a really young age. I think it was something like 23 years old or something like that. And the world would look at that and say, man, that was a waste. He really missed out. And he got sick and died because he was overseas. It probably wouldn't have happened if he stayed in the States. But from a biblical worldview, what he did and his story inspired thousands of other missionaries and sparked this huge missionary movement in America to send missionaries around the world, and it's impacted the world in amazing ways for the kingdom of God. And that life was not a waste. And what he was doing was living a life of integrity and with his biblical worldview. And it was really inspiring for me to learn about William Borden, and I think our students really appreciated that as well.
That's powerful. So we have started to wrap up each episode with a discussion question. So whether you're a parent or guardian or maybe a leader, you've got some student in your life or son or daughter that you would have a good conversation with about this afterwards. And so, guys, for this week, do you have a discussion question to point them to?
Yeah, so the students were given a packet that on the very last page has a bunch of questions that they can explain to you, kind of more details than what we have in this podcast about what they learned, and then there's questions there on that last page that you can talk through with them. But here's just like one or two that we would recommend. Just talk to your student about, well, what does it mean to have a Christian worldview? What did you take away from being there? And just unpack that a little bit. Talk about the practical parts of it too. So you guys could discuss, well, what would it mean for someone who has a Christian worldview if they were in a situation like, say, the ones Trey was talking about before? Maybe a loved one dies. How does being a Christian affect the way you think or feel about that? Maybe you're tempted to cheat in school or other situations. How does having a Christian worldview have a practical impact on your daily life? And I think that would lead to some good discussion.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, you guys. This is a blessing as always. It would help us out if you're listening to this, if you subscribe or like or share this with someone. That'll really help get the word out and hopefully be a blessing to other people that might be wondering about some of the answers to these types of questions. And so if you've got questions about the church connection point, you can go to cp.church. That's a good starting place. Otherwise, we'll be back with another episode here real quick and continue this journey together. God bless.